Thanks a lot for staying into the evening. I hope you have enjoyed the conference so far. Thank you. So for the panel, I've put together a few questions. We are also going to take questions from you. So if there is anything, feel free to raise your hand. And I want to kick off the panel with a question around who is actually interested in microservices. So I spent some time this week with Adrian Cockcroft, and he said that he now sees interest in microservices at C-level executives. So what I'm wondering is, do you see the same thing, and why do you think is it the case that senior level management is now interested in microservices, or should be, or maybe is not yet? So Stefan, do you want to start?
I can confirm that I haven't been in touch with senior management who said that, but that may be because I'm German and we're in Germany and Germans always take longer to get to that kind of stuff. But I did read some things by some crazy venture capitalists who wrote about microservices, not really knowing what it was, but claiming it was the best thing since sliced bread. So probably we'll be doing the same thing next year or so. But I'll pass along the question.
So I'm C-level, so I'm CTO. And this question about microservices is addressed in our startup, but I guess I'm not speaking for all other C-level positions. So, but I pass it over.
I'm starting to see some of the "it's going to solve all of my problems" stuff from C-level executives, not knowing what it is, but it must solve my problems. I mean, SOAP didn't, but this one might. I'm seeing it from sort of more savvy level enterprise architects who are starting to influence their C-level execs at larger enterprise organizations. But those are the sorts of places where it's going to take them years to adopt. So interest, yes. Understanding from those senior level management people, no.
I think a couple of things. I mean, I think there are various companies who are super interested in being agile, right? You know, in some companies it's top-down. CEO has heard about agile, wants to be agile, and then I think that does filter down into needing an architecture that supports agile, right? Which and a big part of that is microservices. And I mean, yeah, and both in the consulting work that I do, I talk to senior people who are into microservices and see that as a path to increasing the velocity of their team.
Yeah, I'd actually probably build on that, to be fair. The majority of C-level people I speak to are interested in adaptability of the systems they build, and they're not seeing adaption being in any way optimized. And microservices give you the options to build adaptability into the design. So they may not understand how it's going to happen. They may not understand all of the technical details of what their organization might look like post it happening. But when you've invested as much money as they often have in the agility of the organization, they then start to look at the software itself and would like to see the agility reflected in those architectures and designs. And they're seeing that as potentially what microservices might bring.
To echo what Chris and Russ said, I see a lot of organizations, a lot of C-level types who are worried, they're terrified of the existential, threat that is some startup, some pair of programmers in their dorm creating the next Uber for X, and they want the ability to respond more nimbly, more quickly, right? And so for them, they see this as part of this larger discussion around Agile. Right, there's a larger discussion around how do I move small batches of work, ideas, concepts, all the way from concept to production quickly. And for them, that's actually a real thing, right? We see software disruption in every industry. All the major industries are being disrupted by software companies, and those who can move software faster are those who, in theory, at least, we hope, stand to win. So that's actually a big thing,
I would actually agree I would actually agree with all of that, but I have to say that that it's more than just microservices, right? They're just seeing, as you said, other companies moving much faster, and it's a bunch of things that makes other companies faster. And microservices is one of them. It could be DevOps or the cloud or being on the web in the first place or taking IT seriously, whatever. And that is definitely happening in a lot of places. I agree with that.
One area where I see, certainly at the more senior levels, it getting traction is sort of as a way of technologists trying to deflect some of this two-speed IT stuff that's coming out. So some people here may have heard of things like pace-layered architecture, two-speed IT, and those are ideas coming out of places like Gartner. And what they talk about in those things is some software needs to go fast, some software needs to go less fast, and that's kind of a useful idea. And that means the software where you are looking to go fast, you might take more risks, you might be okay breaking things. There's other parts of your systems which they need to work. You might be more conservative. And that general idea is useful. This sort of pace-layered architecture, this two-speed IT, though, it often gets translated into, this is a model, you will fit in this model, this is how it will work. I have started seeing some savvier enterprise architects use microservices as a way to take the good bits from those models and adapt them in a more sensible way. Again, it's still early doors, but it could be an interesting adaptation of those ideas.
Okay, so next questions with us all being very enthusiastic about microservices and how they are going to change the world. I think an obvious question is, when would you not use them? And do you see any anti-patterns of wrong usage of microservices in your clients?
Hi. Right, yes. I wrote Hello World yesterday for the 1500th time, and that was the time I didn't use microservices.
I just want to add, I hate the term change the world. It's so overused. I mean, the whole target area for microservices is complex/large applications, whatever that means, right? So yeah, hello world, probably not. But you know, is it 30,000 lines of code? Could be. It might even, you know, it could be 15,000 lines. I mean, it all very, very much depends on whatever you're building, right?
So when I talk from the startup perspective, then I would not recommend introducing microservices from the beginning while you're still in the minimum viable product evaluation phase, where it's very crucial, business critical, that you validate your product on the market. If you are not knowing if your product is hitting the market nerves, I would not first introduce microservices. Instead, I would stick on a monolithic architecture and then evolve from that point.
I agree. The organizations that are trying to flesh out the boundaries of their domain, to understand, to tease out the logical sort of separation of concerns, they're better suited by working with a monolith at first, right? And I think for some people that may be enough. I think the real sort of discriminator is team size. How cost effective is team synchronization, right? If you have a certain threshold of team size and you're able to keep on the same page about what's happening in the system, then maybe that's it. Maybe you can stay at a monolith and never have to move beyond that. But I think the ability to localize communication, whenever you start to introduce team dimensions across geographical dimensions, for example, microservices help. If you're trying to focus teams on a certain feature domain, microservices help. It's when you have communication synchronization that it costs. That's when microservices really help.
I completely agree with that. I think that that you are right, but you are wrong at the same time. So you are right if I interpret your words to mean that if you're willing to rewrite stuff, then you don't have to write the first version as a monolith. That makes as a set of microservice. You can write the first version as a monolith. I completely agree, because a monolith has lots of benefits. It's faster, easier, doesn't have integration overhead, can be built much easier by a single person or a small team, so it's way overkill to start with microservice from that perspective. But if you have that problem already, if you already have several people working on it, then if you were able to build the monolith, you would never have to introduce microservices. The introduction of microservices is the way to succeed in the first place. If you were able to build the system at all without any sort of thing, then obviously your modularization strategy is great already. You don't need anything. My experience is that it doesn't work that way. We fail at building large systems if we build them in a monolithic fashion. It's way too expensive, takes way too much time, so it's not a good idea to start with it. It's not what you meant, I guess, but that's my take on the topic. So I think many people think, we'll worry about this microservices thing later, and it's not needed now. I think that's a dangerous assertion.
Can I just extend on a bit on that? So I'm quite well known for having said, go monolith first when you're discovering the domain. So when you don't know what you're doing, and they don't know what they want, and no one has any idea, then actually just churning on a monolith might be a good idea. What I've seen is that in many respects is driven by our knowledge of the tools we've got. The tools we've got are inadequate to churn quickly on what could be a microservice-based architecture. So at the moment, the inertia of developing microservices is based upon the fact we have to create a new project for every service. We have to go and deploy it, we have to go and test it, we have to go and think about these things in separation. It's a nightmare to build up microservices in that respect. And what I can see potentially as a challenge to the audience maybe is if we could actually decrease the inertia and make microservices or the advantages of microservices easier, then maybe the architectural approach would be something that we just do, rather than being an alternative to monolith. I think the comparison of monolith versus is because we think monolith is faster initially when we're discovering. And it is right now. I wish it wasn't.
I mean, microservices, if you adopt them, will make you slower. They are going to make you slower. They may make you faster eventually, but in the short term, they're going to make you slower. They are going to add risk. They are going to add cognitive load. And if you're a startup trying to discover your business market, yes, domain models matter in terms of finding stable API boundaries. If you don't know how you're going to fuel your company in 6 months from now, there are way more important things you need to be spending your time on. I do think tools absolutely need to get better to support these architectures, but we shouldn't kid ourselves that they're not going to change physics. They're not going to change the inherent challenges around building distributed systems. They're not going to change cap theory, depending on whether or not you think it's a proof. So we should understand that, yes, the tooling should get better. It will lower that barrier. But I think you've got to think about your overall risk profile, what you're trying to achieve. I think for any new young company, young not in terms of age or experience necessarily, but in terms of what the company is, you're going to spend a lot of time up front before microservices are going to give you a return on that investment. And you were talking about that. I mean, someone asked you the questions, are you going slower earlier, weren't they?
Yes.
Well,
yeah, especially, yeah. So when we introduced microservices, it was slowing down our development. So, but for us, it was okay, and we still are going the microservices path. But if I consider us from the beginning, and we don't know if we were not knowing if our product will be successful in the market, and especially also as you said that if you a tiny team, it makes not sense to introduce microservices. So it's a kind of combination of about your product itself and also the team size as well. So, but after a while, yes, you can then extract your microservices. But that's only my experience. That's my recommendations. You don't have to follow this path.
Yeah, this is a really interesting issue, because on the one hand, I do think that if you are a startup trying to figure out what you are doing, then the monolith is kind of that does make it easier to do that. But then when I look back, one example I can talk about is when I look back at the original Cloud Foundry, which was a PaaS for deploying applications on AWS. That was a team of 2 people, right? Tiny by by any standard. And yeah, I mean, was it huge? I don't, possibly, I make up a number, 30,000 lines of code. And it was a monolithic application, but operationally, it was actually doing a whole bunch of complex stuff. And in hindsight, and in a way, the problems I had developing that and operating that was actually what prompted me to get sort of interested in what are now microservices, right? And had we built it using a microservice architecture back then, despite the fact that we were a tiny team, despite the fact that it was a small code base, we would have actually been better off, right? So it's once again, I think it's one of those, it really does depend. And there's no sort of absolutes.
Yeah, actually, I want to belabor that point briefly, at least. I think I'm only doing this because everybody seems to agree that it's better to start with the monoliths, or almost everybody. I think that if you consider that it can help you think about the domain, then it might be a good idea to start with it. You can divide and conquer and separate the large problem into smaller problems, and if different people operate on just one stuff and you have separation of concerns, it's not something to apply blindly. It's stupid to believe that it'll solve all of your problems. Of course not, and many times it will be overkill. But it's not stupid to start with microservices first. It depends absolutely on the context you have and how well you know the domain and how many people you have and lots of other factors as well.
Yeah, and sort of one of the things I've been sort of digging into is the concept of building modular monoliths, right? So like monoliths that are built from event source-based aggregates that are kind of inherently loosely coupled, and so then when it's time to kind of migrate to a microservice architecture, that split is quite easy.
We do need to be really careful when we say monolith. Monolith doesn't mean giant ball of mud. Hands up whoever read Parnass, 1972, right? Modules have been around for a while. The idea that we can break up large code bases into well-factored modules, which potentially could be swappable. We don't tend to do that much, but we can. So a module-based monolith could have a very easy migration path potentially to microservice architecture. Just because it is a monolithic architecture doesn't mean it couldn't be a modular architecture.
Yeah, can I just extend on that? What I've seen is that breakup is often very tricky if the coupling is not considered. So the ability to share under the hood between parts of a system should not be underestimated. At the moment, I can have two very simplified APIs or interfaces and go, hey, that system's decoupled, and then go, actually, a whole bunch of people, including myself, have committed stuff into util and common that is not utilized or common to anyone. And the picking apart of these systems becomes an absolute nightmare to everyone involved. So one of the things that I talk about a lot is this idea of the life preserver and the bounded context, how to actually make sure you don't share what you shouldn't share. And that thinking process is not applied to the majority of software systems at the moment that I've encountered. And it would be great if it was, but it's not that I've seen. And that's the issue, is that we can be modular and then think we are, and it ends up not being so.
I work with a large company in China with hundreds of millions of users, and they actually had that experience where they started with a system that was designed, actually, to my chagrin, very similarly to EGB local sessions versus remote ones, right? They formalized using OSGI the component boundary between their services, and they did it in such a way that these services could be used locally in the same VM, and then teased apart later if they needed to be remote, and it was a matter of configuration. And that actually worked for them. And again, this is a super high scale, top 2% of the whole world website, right? I mean, after Google and maybe Yahoo. I mean, we're talking about a huge, huge scale. And they did that first because they were trying to squeeze every % of utilization out of their machines. But I would also suggest that that's probably not the 80% case, right? Like, that's these mad scientists in China doing amazing things.
I think that's one of the points, right? We lack the discipline to build things in this ideal modular fashion. If we were doing a good job, if we weren't as stupid as we are, we'd be building perfect systems. But we're not. We're unfortunately not that great. So it helps us to have this explicit boundary that's hard to cross, and this things where somebody else might do some stuff and we can't depend on any internal details that ensures that we don't. If it's possible, then somebody will call into that module and, you know, put something into some global variable, a thread, local storage, whatever, and you'll have this hidden path of communication that's not explicit. It's really hard to avoid that.
Yeah, sort of to build. Yeah, to build on that, right? In theory, you can build modular systems, but in practice, like, I think it's quite difficult. And, you know, our programming languages don't really support modularity in any meaningful way, right? That's sort of been forgotten. And then you could say that, you know, if you think about the standard way of building an application is, well, you have your domain model, right? And you persist it with Hibernate or JPA or what? Okay, so you know, and it all works well, except that practically it is a big tangle of domain objects that you cannot partition up into any meaningful way. And yeah, maybe you could be super disciplined and apply bounded context, but within a bounded context, it's still chunked. And then, you know, to do it properly, you really should use aggregates, right? But, you know, how many of us have read that part of the book and taken it seriously? I know. You know, it's taken me 10 years to realize that aggregates are a good thing, because way back it was like it didn't solve any problems that I had. And now in the microservice NoSQL world, it's like, oh yeah, aggregates are a good thing.
I think part of the problem is that the majority of systems have the issues that microservices could solve, but we don't realize until too late. Please. I used to firmly believe in the idea that you start with a monolith and get there. And I had a tool, I still have a tool, that a thinking tool, a design tool, which is a thinking tool, that helps you get there. A better monolith, a better modularized approach. But as Stefan picks out, if we can get around it, we will. The beautiful thing about microservices that I don't think we realize is that it tries to force us not to get around it. We actually have an architectural approach that says these things are separated. So don't go and build libraries that break that boundary. Don't go and build frameworks. You're probably not, well, unless, like me, you used to work at SpringSource, you're probably not in the business of creating frameworks. So don't, because these things are a nightmare. I used to be involved in several companies that were trying to do hiring policies. And one of the things that they would look for is, why don't we hire great people that work for framework or library companies? Don't. They don't think like you. They think like framework and library companies, which is extremely waterfall. You don't want them, because you're probably not. That's probably not a competitive advantage for you. So you're not in the business of creating libraries and frameworks. Separation is a good thing. Create individual pieces that can do the job well. I think that probably summarizes microservices for me.
Okay, so completely different question. So we've seen it. I've listened at least to 2 talks today that talk about how microservices influence the organization. However, there are some reasons why you would use microservices that might not be that much concerned with the organization. Like, for example, you can scale those microservices independently. So what I'm wondering is, do you think that it makes sense to introduce microservices without changing the organization? Have you seen that in practice? Is that something that is common, or is it that it's really microservices plus the organizational change that is like the game that we are playing?
When I speak for ourselves, it was that introducing microservices was because it was at first product and cultural or organizational driven. So before we introduced microservices, we first were talking about or were focusing on usability and user experience improvements at our product and splitting it in specific parts and specific apps, taking care of a specific problem, and that's very well. And on the other hand was that we had one big team at the very beginning, and after a while, everything was taking too long for decisions, for meetings, and for discussions. And so it was more, there evolved the need to split things up. And it was coming from the team themselves. It was not that I said, okay, let's split it. It was, in fact, that they suggested it, that we would like to split things. And also, in addition, we would like to split responsibilities, because it takes too long to, for example, when a bug arises, who takes care of it if there's no real code ownership. So for us, it was kind of like natural evolvement to apply the microservices architecture to our software architecture. So for us, it was fundamental that we have an organizational structure aligned.
I don't think it's essential. I think there's a plethora of reasons why you can view microservices as just a technical implementation detail. And that's absolutely fine. It doesn't need the organizational alignment at all. I think, if anything, organizational changes, for example, moving from project to product, are enhanced by microservices. Microservices don't need the organization. They thrive when those organizational changes happen. They thrive where you have empowered autonomous teams. I think if you have an old-style organization where you still have to go through approvals and sign-offs to get software deployed, the cost of microservices may be higher. If you've got to go to raise a ticket, you've got to go to a separate team to say, can I release my software? And suddenly you go from putting one release through that cycle every 4 weeks to putting 10 releases through that cycle every 4 weeks. It's going to hurt you more. But there are other situations where I think it's completely and utterly appropriate. Scaling, I think, is a very good example. Different technology choices. Security is a very good reason why I might consider subdividing systems to avoid sort of holding too much sensitive data in one place.
Yeah, just to hammer that point home from Sam there, I mean, you're buying options. Bottom line is you're looking for options. With a monolith, you have an option. And what we're looking for is potentially, as a system evolves, a collection of further options that might be important to us. So parts of the system, and the interesting thing is we don't know what options we need yet, because we don't know what we're doing and they don't know what they want. So whilst we're figuring out what those options are, we're trying to maximize for the potential of options in now the software architecture. So yeah, it's fair to say it's not separate from, well, it is separate from the organizational structure and the culture you're attempting to build, but it supports now potentially what that culture might look like.
I basically agree with what's been said. I would also say that it's two orthogonal things, right? The organization can change, technology can change, but when both change together, that's the optimal situation, probably. But you have to be careful that you don't nourish expectations that are not going to be fulfilled if you miss one of those things. So, for example, if you're introducing microservices because of the time-to-market effect, you have to rely on operations changing with the development, because if operations blocks frequent deployments, you're not getting that benefit. Still, there might be many other very good reasons for doing it, but just be careful that for this particular thing you're looking for, you have the organization in place. Otherwise, it won't work.
There's a quite a well-known study in enterprise architecture circles, which that's a sentence I never thought I'd ever say. I should go back and consider my career choices. I think it was a Sloan MIT study that looked at whether or not it made more sense to get your IT more aligned with your business, or whether or not it made sense for you just to make a more efficient IT shop. And they looked at organizations that cleaned up IT, made IT just generally more efficient within some confines, maybe within a suboptimal business to IT relationship, versus those organizations that said, the first thing we're going to focus on is getting business and IT working really, really well together, and then we'll clean house in IT. They found that those organizations that tried to align business and IT before making IT efficient wasted way more money and didn't get the returns on investment. It actually normally made sense to get some level of efficiency in IT first and then to align. And that's been a study, and that's evidence has been, I think, has been reproduced in my own experience of 12 years or so at ThoughtWorks and those of my colleagues as well. Within that framework, microservices as a way to make just delivery of IT more efficient within your existing organizational structure may make a lot of sense. It's about cleaning your own house up first before you ask the business to change their house.
Okay, so I think one of the many talks that weren't submitted to this conference was microservices using Amazon Lambda. You know, there are now serverless deployment possibilities where you can actually have your system and you can deploy individual JavaScript functions or Java functions or whatever on your Amazon platform. So what do you think? Is that going to change the world of microservices? Is there like a synergy between this and microservices? Is it something to watch out for?
I'm quite passionate about this. I think Amazon Lambda is probably the best, well, certainly the best platform that Amazon's come out with, because they can't really do developer platforms. This is the closest thing they've got to a good one. The reason I think it's good and is important is because in the world of microservices, it makes the things that should be easy, easy. It doesn't solve the hard problems, but at the moment, we've got a lot of hard problems that should be easier to solve. This solves the stateless server problem. This solves a whole class of security issues. This solves some money issues. This solves some deployment issues. And I'm looking forward to some people working on frameworks for Mesos that re-implement effectively Lambda-like capabilities on that stack. I think it's a very important step in that technology. The challenge is it's going to shift our thinking again, though, in how we think about operations. Moving, you know, we've got away from this idea about thinking about pets versus cattle, as Adrian's talked to, it's drummed into us. It feels like from an early age, Adrian. We've got away from this idea of servers being long-lived things, but with Lambda, of course, you've got to give away from even a service on an instance you've torn down being long-lived. I think it could be quite transformational for this type of architecture.
Yeah, I mean, certainly Lambda has constraints, you know, on what you can run and so on, and style of the apps and languages and all of that. But you know, I actually think it's huge. I'm super excited about it. So in the sense that, yeah, I can deploy my application without anyone in my organization having to worry about servers in any form or fashion, right? Because, you know, and you look at the alternatives, right? Whether it's, you know, if you're spinning up VMs at the IaaS level or even Docker containers, right? There's still sysadmin type work in there. And then it's like, well, where are you going to run your Docker containers? Most of those involve some notion of getting a machine, right? You know, and which involves some level of sysadmin. Or even, you know, operating a PaaS, that's still, someone has to operate a PaaS and so on. Then on top of that, the per request pricing model is huge, right? As opposed to paying for a VM per hour or per minute. You know, just paying for every request and, you know, time taken, memory used is just kind of huge. So it really, you know, if you think about the whole vision of the cloud, it was like eliminating all that undifferentiated heavy lifting, right? You know, sort of Lambda really does achieve that, provided you can actually understand how to like set up an AWS API gateway, because the documentation makes no sense. Yeah, but apart from that, I just think it's huge.
Do you know any alternatives, or is Lambda the only provider of such technology?
You know, that's That's funny. I suppose I feel that I think it might be the only example of it, right?
Yeah,
I mean, there's some definitional issues around what is serverless deployment, but where you don't have to worry about servers with pay-per-request pricing.
I mean, the technology behind Lambda, it's just a Docker container that's spun up for 60 seconds or so and then shut down when your job ends. That's what's actually happening under the hood. I have seen at least one Mesos framework that re-implements about half of what Lambda is. It doesn't deal with the gateway issue. The underlying technique, which is spinning up per container-based requests, is a technique that has been used for at least the last 5 years and probably going back further. Google have been using this technique for many, many years. So the underlying technique is very, very sound. I think Lambda is the first generally available framework that re-implements that, and they do so by standing on the shoulders of ECS, and therefore ECS and EBS and ELBs and SNS and SQS. I can keep going. But I do think we will start seeing similar frameworks coming out. The issue, of course, is if you think about most organizations, your entire fleet isn't purely stateless. And so you will need a bit of a mix. There will be things that will fit very nicely into a Lambda style stack. There will be things that need to be longer running lived processes. And so when we're looking at competitors that offer a similar Lambda-like experience, they've also got to be a platform where you can do the other stuff as well. And that's the hard thing to do, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I look at AWS, and if nothing else, they've got this incredible engine that figures out what the market needs and delivers it. And I mean, if anyone knows me, I tend to be very cynical, often curmudgeonly about technology. But AWS is one of the sort of few companies that genuinely impresses me in their ability to just, I've been following them for, 10 years now. And it's like, wow. I mean, they constantly deliver.
I think one of the interesting facets to this whole discussion is that the value stream that's involved, right? So you've got software that you need to build, you need to deploy, you need to make it valuable. Lambda gives you that capability to drop code very quickly into what is essentially a form of production. I think what we're missing is the rest of the framework around what that looks like for the majority of people coming from other parts of the industry. So there's lots of people that, don't have stateless systems. Yeah, I completely understand that. But also, there are people that the idea, the frightening possibility that they might actually make changes right now and it's done is a big deal as well. So anything that sits in this space, which is an exciting space, I agree. Lambda is probably the first thing that's come out of Amazon that I've sat there and gone, thank goodness someone did that, because it makes writing my book fundamentally easier, and yet I still can't finish the darn thing. When it came out, I was like, great, someone's actually finally got where I was going, and they did it completely without my help. So the idea that you can actually drop code and change code very quickly, fundamentally, is good, but there's a lot of industry dragging behind that is not ready.
I agree with everyone who said it's huge. I think it's really world-changing, just to please you. I also don't see the stateless problem. I mean, it's not as if you can't keep state. You just have to be explicit about the state. You don't have session state or anything like that, but you shouldn't have that anyway, so I can totally live with that, and I think it's awesome if they integrate the workflow stuff. What's it called? I always forget the names. What's the one with the, whatever. They've got this workflow.
Simple workflow?
Exactly, that is. So it's not yet integrated, it's maybe not simple, whatever. If they can add stuff on top of that, I think it's gonna be really, it's going to be a role model for many other things that implement similar stuff, and at the moment I think it's pretty unique. Many people have the restriction that they can't run or don't want to run stuff on Amazon, and many people have the restriction that they have existing systems that don't have this architecture. But still, it's going to be really transformational, I think.
Okay, so we've spent quite some time talking, across ourselves. So is there any question that you might ask, that you want to ask from the audience? There is one.
When I first got introduced to microservices, some people were calling it SOA done right, and other people were calling it SOA 2.0. So I want to ask you, what do you think is the relationship between microservices and SOA?
So I used to say I wrote the book, so I win. But there are two other people who have written microservices books up here. My definition is that microservices is a form of service-oriented architecture. So in the same way as the XP or Scrum is a form of Agile, microservices are just a sort of opinionated set of ways of achieving SOA. That's my own personal view. There are other forms of SOA that may be right, but I didn't write books about them, so I'm not interested.
Oh, I would just add, yeah, it's sort of like, well, it's lowercase SOA, right? Whereas to me, uppercase SOA is sort of, well, a bunch of, what's the word, crap?
Do you mean middleware?
Yeah, well, yeah, all that WS star specifications, right? SOAP, which is not really simple, and expensive vendor ESBs and all of that middleware. Plus, then when you dig into it, there are some fundamental differences. Like, I think one key SOA pattern is the canonical domain model, right? Which is like a global domain model of effectively one bounded context for your entire system, whereas, there's many people argue each microservice is its own bounded context with its own domain model, and so on. So there's some pretty, which is a pretty fundamental difference. But I mean, having said that, I hate the term microservice because the first thing you hear is micro, which then goes down the, it must be 100 lines of code kind of argument, which I think is wrong. Sorry, Fred.
Sorry, yeah. I think when it comes to SOA or not, regardless of the fact the acronym doesn't translate well into Dutch, I think that, generally speaking, what you're looking for is a certain set of qualities from your system. And the biggest question you can ask as a provider of IT in any sense, or an organization that, frankly, everyone relies on being provided by IT, is what can my system do now that it couldn't do before? Now, whether it's service-orientated or not is not really important. What's more important is, what have I enabled? Can I change this system faster than others? Can I go faster as a collective? Can I have 18 teams working on this for fun? Can I do these things with confidence? Can I drop into production quickly? Can I get there faster than someone else? Those are the properties that matter. SOA was a wonderful consultancy term, speaking as a consultant in the past. And I think that we've got a little bogged down on whether it is or isn't. Of course it's service-oriented, it's in the title. Microservices, apparently. And I agree, I think the term is terrible. First of all, size doesn't matter. What does the system do that it can't do before? That's in my opinion, that should be what motivates us all.
I think there are a few things So of course, I don't think had such a bent on agility, right? So reusable services versus small services or at least cognitively comprehensible services. There's a difference between having something that you stood up and you could release a SOA architecture every 6 months. There was no implied agility in that, right? It was just reusable, singly focused sort of things. I saw Neil Ford talk about this. Neil Ford talks about orchestration versus choreography. There's several characteristics. One that really struck me was this idea of, and then Martin Fowler talked about this as well, right? Smart pipes versus dumb services. So before, you had this idea of orchestration where you had at some point in the SOA architecture this idea of an ESB or whatever, Beeple, something that was very smart that would orchestrate a lot of other services. And there was a center brain to that, right? Whereas with microservices, I think a lot of these services are very smart. They're supposed to be choreographed. They're independently deployable, managed. They're smart. They could do what they need to do on themselves, by themselves. They had this smart within themselves to be sort of resilient, right? And the analogy that I think Neil Ford gave was, imagine choreography. You've got somebody conducting a symposium, and with the symposium, you've got one person leading the musicians, and of course, if that one person should go away, everything's in trouble, right? Versus orchestration. Orchestration versus choreography. With choreography, everybody on the ballet stage is able to do what he or she is supposed to do. If they should fall down, they stand up, brush their shoulders off, and keep going. There's an implied bit of smartness, intelligence to each service, and that resilience is, I think, very important. This idea of a single brain doesn't apply in microservices. That really struck me, because in a distributed system, this idea that you're going to amortize, you're going to build for highly available systems by having a smart brain that controls everything, it doesn't work. So you have to move that intelligence to each service, make them resilient, and make them able to do the right thing in terms of failure, right? So time to remediation, time to graceful degradation, all that stuff. That's very important.
There was a distinction there that Josh mentioned, I think it's worth drawing on when you think of traditional implementations of SOA versus what we now think of for microservices. The majority of enterprises, if you ask them why they were looking to adopt SOA, they would say it is about reuse. The idea is that reuse would mean they're writing less of the same code, and therefore out of that would come A, lower costs, and B, they could go faster because they're writing less of the same code over and over again. What we've realized, though, is that reuse isn't a very good end goal. And with microservices, we're not optimizing for reuse. Organizations that are adopting microservices they're optimizing for time to market. And it's a subtle distinction, but it is one that drives some very, very different behaviors. You relax, you're not so worried about things like canonical data models. You're not so worried about code sharing between services that can itself become a form of coupling. In many ways, microservices benefits hugely from continuous delivery, where we have a focus on how fast can we get something from a laptop to a live environment. And so that's really, it's built on the back of that. So I think that might be, although I still think it is a form of the overall idea that breaking things into services is a good idea, that mindset shift. It's not about reuse, it's about time to market.
I would add that even back then, many people were arguing for the exact same things. For example, the orchestration choreography kind of thing is a decade old or so, so there is even a standard WS choreography, whatever, where people were arguing for that. So many of the things that were wrong back then are just as wrong today. And at least one trait is unfortunately shared between SOA and microservices. People just define it to mean whatever they want it to mean, right? Whatever serves their purpose. So it's not that clearly defined. Still, I think when people claim that they were saying this all along, they may actually have a point. Some of them did that.
Okay, any more questions from the audience?
So if it's a cattle of pets, but then what is a lambda? Is it a fly on the cattle? Or? So if you have cattle and pets, right? So the pets are the boring old individual snowflakey machines, and the cattle are the fleets of machines in the cloud. And then you've got lambda on top. Are those fleas or flies, or what's would you like to come up with the appropriate analogy that we can all standardize on?
I think your pet is now a hive. With the individual things you don't care about, your pet, the thing you care about is the hive. You don't care about the fly or the ant.
You're programming the bees or the ants or whatever, though, right?
It's like bees. If only someone put that on the front of their book, Adrian.
Yeah, exactly. There we go. All right.
And that's actually a good way to come to the next point. So we still need to draw a few books. So we have 3 copies of Sam's book translated into German, and
I did not do the translation, which everyone should breathe a sigh of relief if they've ever heard me ordering beer in Germany.
I think there are even Bs on the German title too.
There are different Bs, German Bs.
German Bs.
They are much more organised than Australian Bs.
and they are in black, red, and yellow, I guess. Okay, so we are going to draw 3 copies of that book. It's not here yet, so whoever wins it, we will send it to you. And 3 copies of my book. So I have the box right here.
Now, your book was written natively in German, and therefore for German speakers is likely to be, intelligible. I still haven't found out who did my translation.
I don't know. I mean, I have to admit that I didn't read your German translation, but I assume it's pretty good. So, what are we supposed to do? I don't know.
You're the boss, aren't you?
Do you want to? Shall we start with your book? So then, please draw 3 cards for.
We could do
book.
one each. Susanne, you could draw one, then I'll draw one, and then these guys could.
Yeah,
we're drawing 6 in total. That way we get to share the power. Next person? Yeah, pass it. I'll do that. Stefan?
It's actually.
So these are for my book or your book?
For your book.
These are for your book. Okay, these are for my book. Okay, so I've got Manfred Ratzmann from Deutsche Post. Deutsche Post, we can use your company to send you the book.
So I have Tom Yelen.
Tom, you need to provide your email.
So can you come up here and write down your address so we can send it out to you?
I have Abid Vasim Zenica, I guess. Abid, are you here?
Are you here?
He's not here. If someone knows who he is.
He's not here. But you know where he is and you will let him know. Perfect.
So I have Clemens Rodde. What do you think? R-O-D-D-E.
CIO, you better get his name.
Oh, yeah. Chief Information Officer of 24 Technology. How do you say your last name?
So that would be yours then. Okay.
Am I drawing from the same book? Yeah. Okay. Klaus Jorgensen. I got the easy one, right? Come in, Klaus. You're a winner.
I've drawn Oliver Nowak, N-O-A-C-K. Congrats, you win. Yay! Hooray!
Okay.
Well, that was cool.
So, let me see. So we still need to have the address of Abid Vasim.
Yeah.
Okay, so you'll just come over later on. Okay, so thanks a lot for joining the panel and listening to us and asking a few those questions. So we will walk over to the Irish pub. My colleague Konrad, who is standing right here, he will lead us the way. The address is Friedrichstraße 112.
It's the closest Irish pub called the Oscar Wilde.
Yeah, so you can ask Google Maps or whatever. Okay, yeah. Thanks a lot and see you tomorrow morning.
And if
And if you don't trust the Irish pub, I will leave 10 past 8 and bring you there.
Wow.
I ever so briefly was